The morning sun broke hard over the flat Oklahoma plains, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Route 66. The Starlight Motel sat like a forgotten relic on the roadside, its neon sign flickering with 2 letters burned out. It was the kind of place travelers passed through without remembering, where truckers grabbed coffee and families stretched their legs before pushing west toward better things. On May 17, 2007, 23-year-old Jennifer Calloway checked into room 14 with nothing but a duffel bag and eyes that looked like they'd been crying for days. The desk clerk, an elderly man named Vernon who'd worked there since 1982, remembered her because she paid cash and asked if there was anywhere quiet she could think. He pointed her toward the empty swimming pool out back, drained years ago and filled with tumbleweeds now. Jennifer had driven from Little Rock, Arkansas, where she'd lived her entire life in a cramped apartment with her mother and younger brother. Her father had left when she was 8, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. Jennifer was the first in her family to go to college, studying elementary education at the University of Central Arkansas. She was supposed to graduate the following week. But 3 days before she left, something happened that nobody could quite explain. Her roommate, Ashley Torres, told police that Jennifer received a phone call around midnight. Ashley was half asleep, but heard Jennifer's voice change, heard her say, "I'll come, and don't do this," before the conversation ended. The next morning, Jennifer packed her car and told Ashley she needed to clear her head, that she'd be back for graduation. She never was. Before we continue with Jennifer's story, if you're finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Stories like Jennifer's need to be told, and your support helps us bring them to light. Vernon remembered that Jennifer stayed in her room most of that first evening. He saw her walk to the vending machine once, then return carrying a can of soda and a bag of chips. The motel had 6 other guests that night, a family from Texas, 2 salesmen, and a couple on their honeymoon. None of them reported seeing anything unusual. The next morning, May 18th, the housekeeper found room 14 empty. The bed was made. Jennifer's duffel bag was gone. Her car, a silver 2004 Honda Accord, was no longer in the parking lot. Vernon called the local sheriff's office that afternoon when Jennifer didn't check out and he couldn't reach her. Deputy Frank Holloway arrived within the hour, a man in his mid-40s who'd seen his share of people passing through town and disappearing into new lives. He took notes, filed a report, but told Vernon that young people leave all the time, especially when they're running from something. Still, he called it in to the state police. Jennifer's mother, Patricia Calloway, received the call 2 days later. She drove to Oklahoma immediately, her hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. Patricia checked every hospital, every police station, every shelter within 100 miles. She plastered Jennifer's photo on telephone poles and handed out flyers at truck stops. The family from Texas remembered seeing a young woman matching Jennifer's description, but they'd been too focused on their arguing children to pay much attention. The salesman didn't remember her at all. Weeks turned into months. The case went cold. Patricia hired a private investigator who traced Jennifer's credit card activity. She'd used it once at a gas station in Hydro, Oklahoma, about 40 miles west of the motel, around 10 in the morning on May 18th. The surveillance footage showed Jennifer pumping gas, her face obscured by sunglasses and a baseball cap. She went inside, bought a bottle of water, and left. The cashier didn't remember her. After that, nothing. No credit card activity, no phone calls, no trace. The investigator, a former police detective named Marcus Reed, interviewed everyone at the motel again. He pressed Vernon about the phone calls to the room. There had been 2 incoming calls the night Jennifer stayed there, both from different payphones along Route 66. One was from Weatherford, about 20 miles east. The other was from Clinton, 30 miles west. Marcus drove to both locations, showed Jennifer's photo around, but nobody recognized her. The payphones had been removed years ago anyway. Patricia never stopped searching. She kept Jennifer's room exactly as it had been, her textbook still stacked on the desk, her teaching certificate application half filled on the computer. Jennifer's younger brother, Daniel, was only 15 when his sister disappeared. He grew up haunted by her absence, dropping out of high school at 17 and spiraling into depression. Patricia held the family together with prayers and determination, but every birthday, every holiday, every graduation, Jennifer missed carved deeper wounds. By 2010, the official search had ended. The case remained open but inactive. Patricia attended support groups for families of missing persons, where she met others who understood the particular torture of not knowing, not having a body to bury, not having answers, not having closure. She befriended Helen Kowalski, whose daughter had vanished in 1998, and together they advocated for better resources for missing persons cases, especially those involving adults who disappeared voluntarily. The years dragged on like a slow bleed. Patricia retired from her job at the hospital in 2015, unable to focus anymore. She spent her days maintaining a Facebook page dedicated to finding Jennifer, posting updates, sharing age progression photos created by forensic artists. The page had 3,000 followers, mostly other families of missing persons, true crime enthusiasts, and people who simply cared. Sometimes Patricia would receive tips, but they always led nowhere. A woman who looked like Jennifer in Phoenix, a waitress in Denver with the same laugh. None of them were her daughter. Daniel struggled with addiction in his early 20s, using alcohol to numb the guilt he carried. He felt responsible somehow, felt like he should have noticed something was wrong before Jennifer left. He'd been too absorbed in his own teenage problems to see that his sister was in trouble. By 2016, after his third DUI, he entered rehab and slowly began rebuilding his life. He got sober, got his GED, and started working construction. He never talked about Jennifer, but Patricia knew he thought about her every day. In 2024, 17 years after Jennifer disappeared, a team of researchers from the University of Oklahoma launched a geological survey project along historic Route 66. They were using LiDAR technology, light detection and ranging, to map the terrain and document how the landscape had changed over decades of development and abandonment. The team, led by Dr. Raymond Foster, a geologist specializing in erosion patterns, flew drones equipped with laser scanners over hundreds of miles of highway, capturing data that could penetrate vegetation and reveal ground-level features invisible to the naked eye. In March 2025, a graduate student named Nicole Brennan was analyzing the LiDAR data when she noticed something unusual about 6 miles west of the Starlight Motel. The scans showed a depression in the earth near an old, overgrown access road that had once connected to Route 66, but had been closed since the late 1990s. The area was thick with scrub brush and mesquite trees, and the depression suggested something large had been buried or had sunk into the ground over time. Dr. Foster was intrigued. The depression was rectangular, roughly the size of a vehicle, and the surrounding soil showed signs of disturbance that didn't match natural erosion patterns. He contacted the Oklahoma Highway Patrol, thinking it might be related to old construction debris or an illegal dumping site. The Highway Patrol forwarded the information to the sheriff's office, and Deputy Thomas Brennan, no relation to Nicole, drove out to investigate. What Thomas found when he pushed through the brush took his breath away. Partially buried beneath nearly 2 decades of sediment, leaves and overgrowth was the rusted roof of a silver Honda Accord. The car had rolled or been driven down a steep embankment that dropped 15 feet from the old access road, landing in a dry creek bed that only filled during heavy rains. Over the years, flash floods had deposited layer after layer of mud and debris, gradually burying the vehicle until it was almost completely hidden from view. Thomas called for backup immediately. Within hours, a forensic team arrived with excavation equipment. They worked carefully, documenting everything as they slowly revealed more of the car. The license plate was still attached, though corroded. When they ran it through the system, it came back registered to Jennifer Marie Calloway of Little Rock, Arkansas. The case that had gone cold 18 years ago suddenly burned white-hot again. They found her remains in the driver's seat, still wearing her seatbelt. The medical examiner would later determine that she died on impact. The car had struck several trees on the way down the embankment, and the force had been fatal. There were no signs of foul play, no evidence of another vehicle being involved. The toxicology report, though compromised by time, showed no alcohol or drugs in her system. Patricia received the call on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. She was 71 years old now, her hair completely grey, her hands arthritic from years of folding and unfolding Jennifer's missing person flyers. When Deputy Thomas told her they'd found Jennifer's car, Patricia couldn't speak. When he told her they'd found Jennifer, she collapsed in her kitchen, the phone clattering to the floor. Her neighbour heard her sobbing through the walls and came to help. The funeral was held on a Saturday in April, 18 years and 11 months after Jennifer had checked into the Starlight Motel. The church was packed with people who'd never met Jennifer, but had followed her case online, had prayed for Patricia, had hoped for a different ending. Ashley Torres came from California, where she now taught 3rd grade. Vernon drove in from Oklahoma, bent and frail at 89. Marcus Reed, the private investigator, sat in the back row with tears streaming down his face. Daniel stood at the pulpit and spoke about his sister for the first time in 18 years. He talked about how Jennifer used to help him with his homework, how she'd saved money from her part-time job at the library to buy him a bicycle for his 13th birthday. He talked about the hole her disappearance had carved in their family, and how finding her, even like this, had finally allowed him to breathe. The investigation into how Jennifer ended up in that ravine continued. Detectives traced those payphone calls from 2007, pulling old phone company records that had been archived digitally. The calls had been made from the same number, a cell phone registered to a man named Christopher Dwight, who'd lived in Weatherford at the time. When police tracked him down in Texas, where he now lived with a wife and 2 children, Christopher initially denied knowing Jennifer, but when confronted with the phone records, he finally broke. Christopher had met Jennifer online in early 2007 on a forum for college students. They'd talked for months, and he'd fallen for her hard. She'd told him she was stressed about graduation, about the pressure her family put on her to succeed. He'd suggested they meet, and she'd agreed. But when she drove out to Oklahoma, and they finally met in person at a diner in Weatherford, something shifted. Jennifer realized she'd made a mistake. She told Christopher she couldn't do this, that she needed to go home. He'd begged her to stay, called her repeatedly that night from different payphones, trying to convince her. She'd finally agreed to meet him one more time the next morning. They'd met at that closed access road, away from the highway where no one would see them. Christopher wanted to talk her into staying, into giving them a chance, but Jennifer had been firm. She told him she was leaving, that she was sorry, but this wasn't what she wanted. Christopher claimed he'd driven away, angry and hurt. He swore he didn't know what had happened after that he never saw her car go off the embankment, but he'd been afraid to come forward after she disappeared, afraid people would think he'd hurt her. The investigators couldn't prove Christopher was lying, but they couldn't prove he was telling the truth either. The physical evidence suggested Jennifer had simply missed the curve where the access road turned sharply. The ground was loose gravel, And if she'd been upset or distracted, it would have been easy to lose control. There were no skid marks on the pavement because the road itself had deteriorated. There were no witnesses because the area was isolated. Without clear evidence of foul play, and with Christopher maintaining he'd left before the accident, the district attorney declined to file charges. Patricia struggled with this reality. Part of her wanted someone to blame, someone to hold accountable for 18 years of agony. But another part of her, the part that had spent nearly 2 decades in limbo, simply felt relieved to finally know. Jennifer hadn't run away to start a new life. She hadn't abandoned her family. She'd been trying to come home, and something had gone terribly wrong. The remains were cremated, and Patricia kept half the ashes in an urn on her mantel. The other half she and Daniel drove to Oklahoma, back to that stretch of Route 66, where they scattered them in the prairie grass as the sun set over the plains. Vernon came with them, and so did Dr. Foster and Nicole Brennan, the graduate student whose careful eye had finally brought Jennifer home. As they stood there in the fading light, Patricia thought about all the times she'd driven this highway, searching, calling Jennifer's name into the wind. Her daughter had been here all along, so close and yet invisible, hidden beneath the earth like a secret the land had kept. Patricia thought about all the other families still searching, still hoping, still trapped in that terrible space between loss and closure. She thought about how many more missing persons might be out there, waiting to be found, waiting for technology, or chance, or simple persistence to reveal their stories. Daniel placed a small marker where the car had been found, a simple stone with Jennifer's name and dates etched into the surface. It wasn't legal, and it probably wouldn't last, but it mattered to him. This was the last place his sister had been alive, and he wanted the world to remember she'd existed, that she'd mattered, that her absence had shattered lives. On the drive back to Arkansas, Patricia and Daniel stopped at the Starlight Motel. Vernon had retired the previous year, and the new owners had renovated the place, painting it cheerful colors and replacing the burned-out neon. Room 14 was now a bright, clean space that looked nothing like it had in 2007. Patricia stood in the doorway for a long time, trying to imagine Jennifer here, trying to understand what had been going through her daughter's mind that last night. They never found any note, any journal, any explanation for why Jennifer had driven to Oklahoma to meet someone she barely knew. Patricia would never know what desperation or hope or loneliness had driven her daughter to that decision. But she knew that Jennifer had been 23 years old, on the cusp of everything, and that the world had been too much for her in that moment. She knew that her daughter had been human and complicated and struggling, just like everyone else. The story made national news. The dramatic discovery, a car buried for 18 years, revealed by advanced technology, captured public imagination. True crime podcasts covered the case. News stations interviewed Patricia and Daniel. Christopher Dwight gave one interview on camera, where he cried and apologized and insisted he'd never meant for any of this to happen. Some people believed him, others didn't. The online communities that had followed Jennifer's case for years erupted in debate about accountability and justice, and what it meant to be responsible for someone's death without technically causing it. But for Patricia and Daniel, the noise eventually faded. What remained was the quiet reality of grief that could finally begin to settle. Patricia started sleeping through the night for the first time in 18 years. She didn't wake up at 3 a.m. anymore, wondering if Jennifer was alive somewhere, needing help. She didn't jump every time the phone rang, hoping for news. The not knowing had been its own special torture, and as much as the truth hurt, it was better than the endless questions. Daniel proposed to his girlfriend Emma 2 months after they buried Jennifer. At the wedding, he left an empty seat in the front row with Jennifer's photo on it. In his toast, he thanked his sister for teaching him about love and loss and the importance of not taking a single day for granted. He and Emma named their first daughter Jennifer, and when little Jenny asked about her namesake, Daniel told her about the aunt she'd never meet, the one who loved books and wanted to teach children and who'd gotten lost trying to find her way. Patricia lived 7 more years, passing peacefully in her sleep at 78. Her obituary mentioned her work advocating for missing persons, and it said she was survived by her son Daniel, his wife Emma, and their 3 children. It said she was preceded in death by her daughter Jennifer, who she'd never stopped loving and never stopped searching for. At her funeral, Daniel read a letter his mother had written to Jennifer in 2012, during one of the darkest periods of not knowing. In it, Patricia wrote, "Wherever you are, whatever happened, I want you to know that you were enough. You were always enough, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." The technology that found Jennifer continued to advance. In the years after her discovery, LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar were used to locate 17 other vehicles in remote areas across the United States, solving 10 missing persons cases. Dr. Foster's team partnered with the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, using their data to help other families find answers. Nicole Brennan, now Dr. Brennan, dedicated her career to forensic geology, using science to bring closure to the disappeared. The Starlight Motel still stands on Route 66, though it's changed hands twice more since 2025. The current owners know the story. Everyone who lives along this stretch of highway does. Sometimes people stop and ask to see room 14, to stand where Jennifer stood on her last night. The owners are always respectful, always patient. They understand that places hold memories, that tragedy creates its own kind of pilgrimage site. And on certain evenings, when the sun sets over the Oklahoma plains and the wind moves through the tall grass, you can drive past that marker Daniel placed and see flowers there, left by strangers who never knew Jennifer but who were moved by her story. They leave notes too, small messages tucked beneath stones. "Rest in peace. You're not forgotten. I hope you found your way home." Because in the end, that's what everyone wants, to be remembered, to be found, to come home. Jennifer Calloway spent 18 years beneath the earth, hidden and silent, while her family searched in vain. But she wasn't truly lost. She was always there, waiting for technology and chance and human determination to reveal her resting place. And when they finally brought her home, when they laid her to rest with love and tears and the kind of fierce devotion only family can provide, Jennifer Calloway became more than a missing person statistic. She became a reminder that every disappearance is a story. Every story matters, and sometimes the ground itself holds secrets until we're ready to hear them. The stretch of Route 66, where Jennifer's car was found, has been added to several missing persons databases as a case study in how technology can solve cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country now use similar methods to search for other missing individuals in remote areas. Jennifer's case changed how investigators approach long-term disappearances, proving that even after decades, answers can still be found. And somewhere in Arkansas, Daniel's daughter Jenny plays in the backyard, laughing and bright, carrying her aunt's name forward into a future Jennifer never got to see. She knows the story of her namesake, knows about the young woman who loved to read and wanted to teach, and who made one wrong turn on a dusty Oklahoma road. And when Jenny looks up at the stars on clear nights, Daniel tells her that's where her Aunt Jennifer is now, finally at peace, finally home, finally free from the earth that held her for so long. The case of Jennifer Calloway closed officially in 2026, marked as accidental death with no criminal charges filed. But for those who loved her, the case will never truly close. She lives on in memory and story, In the advocacy work her mother started, in the technology that found her, in the daughter who carries her name. She lives on every time someone drives past that marker on Route 66 and remembers that behind every missing person poster is a family in agony, a life interrupted, a story demanding to be told. Jennifer went missing, leaving a motel on Route 66 on May 18, 2007. 18 years later, an aerial scan revealed her car buried in a ravine, finally giving her family the answers they'd searched for through decades of anguish. The ending wasn't the one Patricia had prayed for, but it was an ending nonetheless. And sometimes, in the realm of missing persons, that's the closest thing to mercy families can hope to find. The years following Jennifer's discovery brought unexpected ripples through the community of families with missing loved ones. Patricia's Facebook page, which had documented her 18-year search, became a resource for others navigating the same nightmare. Before her death, Patricia had worked with a non-profit organization called Bring Them Home, which advocated for the use of advanced technology in cold cases. Her story became a blueprint for how persistence and innovation could intersect to provide answers. In 2026, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Mendez reached out to Daniel, asking if he'd be willing to participate in a film about Jennifer's case. Daniel was hesitant at first. The wound was still fresh, and the idea of reliving everything on camera felt overwhelming. But Emma encouraged him, reminding him that his mother had spent her final years trying to help other families, and this could be an extension of that work. The documentary, titled Beneath the Mother Road, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2027. It traced Jennifer's story from her disappearance through the LiDAR discovery, but it also explored the broader issue of missing persons in America. The hundreds of thousands of people who vanish each year, the families left behind, and the inadequate resources devoted to finding them. Daniel's on-camera interviews were raw and honest. He talked about his addiction, his guilt, his mother's unwavering hope. He talked about what it meant to finally have answers, even when those answers brought new kinds of pain. The film won the Audience Award and sparked conversations across the country about how technology could be better utilized in missing persons cases. Several states passed legislation in the following years requiring periodic aerial surveys of remote areas using LiDAR and similar technologies. The Jennifer Callaway Act, as it became known in Oklahoma, mandated that the state conduct annual technological surveys of areas near highways and known dumping sites, with data cross-referenced against missing persons reports. Christopher Dwight watched the documentary from his home in Texas. He'd moved twice since Jennifer's discovery, trying to escape the scrutiny and judgment that followed him everywhere. His wife had left him 6 months after the investigation concluded, taking their children to her mother's house in Arizona. Christopher's employer, a construction company, had let him go after clients started canceling contracts. He'd become a pariah, guilty in the court of public opinion, even if the legal system hadn't charged him. One night in February 2027, Christopher drove back to Oklahoma. He parked at that same closed-access road where he'd met Jennifer for the last time. He sat in his truck for 3 hours, drinking from a bottle of whiskey and crying. He thought about calling Daniel, about trying to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. He thought about the girl he'd fallen for online, the brief meeting at the diner, the desperation in her eyes when she told him she needed to leave. He thought about how he'd been angry, how he'd called her repeatedly, how he'd pressured her to meet him one more time. Christopher never made that call. Instead, he checked himself into a psychiatric hospital the next morning, telling the intake nurse he was having thoughts of suicide. He spent 6 weeks there, working with therapists to untangle the guilt and shame that had consumed him. He eventually moved to Montana, where nobody knew his name or his story, and took a job as a night janitor at an elementary school. He lived alone in a studio apartment, and every year on May 18th, he made an anonymous donation to bring them home in Jennifer's name. Meanwhile, the technology that had found Jennifer continued to evolve. By 2028, artificial intelligence programs could analyze LiDAR data automatically, flagging anomalies that might indicate buried vehicles or disturbed Earth. A company called Terra Search, founded by Dr. Foster and Nicole Brennan, partnered with law enforcement agencies across 15 states to conduct systematic searches of remote areas. Over the next 3 years, they located 43 vehicles in various states of concealment, solving 26 missing persons cases. Not all the discoveries were as old as Jennifer's. In Utah, they found a car that had been missing for 6 months, the driver having suffered a medical emergency and driven off a desert road. In Oregon, they located a vehicle from 1991 in a ravine similar to Jennifer's, finally giving a family answers after 37 years. In New Mexico, they discovered evidence of a potential crime, leading to the arrest and conviction of a man who'd killed his business partner and hidden the body in the remote wilderness. The Calloway family story intersected with one of these cases in an unexpected way. In 2029, Terra Search identified a buried vehicle in western Arkansas, about 60 miles from where Jennifer had lived. The car belonged to Marcus Chen, a college student who disappeared in 2009, 2 years after Jennifer. Marcus's mother, Linda Chen, had followed Jennifer's case closely during her own search for her son. She'd even reached out to Patricia once, and the two women had exchanged emails, offering each other comfort in their shared grief. When Daniel learned that technology inspired by his sister's case had helped find Marcus, he contacted Linda. They met for coffee in Little Rock, two people bound by parallel tragedies and unexpected resolution. Linda told Daniel that knowing Patricia's story had kept her going during the darkest times, had given her hope that answers were possible even when years passed. They stayed in touch, eventually co-founding a support group for families who'd lost loved ones to unexplained disappearances. The support group met monthly in a church basement in Little Rock. 15 to 20 people typically attended: parents, siblings, spouses, children of the disappeared. They shared stories, cried together, and discussed new technologies and search methods. Daniel often brought his children, teaching them young about compassion and community. Jenny, now 7 years old, would sometimes draw pictures for the other members, colorful images of flowers and sunshine that people taped to their refrigerators as reminders that beauty still existed even in grief. At one meeting in 2030, a woman named Teresa Hoffman shared that her daughter had been missing for 11 years. She'd vanished after leaving a gas station in western Kansas, driving toward Colorado for a job interview she never arrived at. Teresa had spent over a decade searching, hiring private investigators, organizing volunteer search parties, and plastering social media with appeals for information. She was exhausted and broke, having spent her retirement savings on the search. Daniel listened to Teresa's story and recognized the same desperation he'd seen in his mother for so many years. After the meeting, he approached Teresa and told her about Terra Search. He offered to reach out to Dr. Foster personally to see if they could prioritize surveying the route Teresa's daughter would have taken. Teresa broke down crying, hugging Daniel and thanking him repeatedly. 2 months later, Terra Search identified a vehicle matching the description of Teresa's daughter's car in a ravine near the Colorado border. The remains inside were identified through dental records. Teresa finally had her daughter home. These connections, families helping families, tragedies leading to solutions that prevented other tragedies, became Daniel's purpose. He cut back his hours at the construction company and began working part-time with Bring Them Home, using his experience and his mother's legacy to advocate for missing persons. He testified before the Arkansas state legislature, pushing for increased funding for cold case units and technological surveys. He gave interviews on local news stations, always carrying Jennifer's photo, always telling her story. Emma supported him fully, even as it meant financial sacrifices for their growing family. Their second child, a son they named Thomas after the deputy who'd found Jennifer, was born in 2031. Their third, another daughter named Patricia, arrived in 2033. The house was chaos, toys everywhere, kids always needing something, but it was filled with love and life, things Daniel had thought impossible during those dark years after Jennifer disappeared. On weekends, Daniel would sometimes drive his family out to Oklahoma. They'd stop at the Starlight Motel, which had become a strange sort of landmark in missing persons advocacy. The owners had eventually embraced the history, creating a small memorial in the lobby with Jennifer's photo and information about missing persons resources. Visitors could leave notes in a journal, messages of hope or remembrance. The journal filled up every few months, and the owners sent the completed volumes to Daniel, who kept them in boxes in his garage. Vernon passed away in 2032 at 96 years old. His obituary mentioned his decades working at the Starlight Motel and noted that he'd been the last person to see Jennifer Calloway before her disappearance. Daniel attended the funeral and spoke briefly, thanking Vernon for his kindness to Jennifer during her last night, for remembering the details that had helped investigators, for caring about a stranger who'd passed through his life for less than 24 hours. Vernon's grandson later gave Daniel a handwritten note Vernon had kept in his desk drawer for 25 years, a reminder to always see people, to always pay attention, because you never know when your memory might be the key that brings someone home. The technology continued advancing at a remarkable pace. By 2034, drones equipped with ground-penetrating radar could survey vast areas in hours, with AI analyzing the data in real time. Several companies competed in the market, driving innovation and making the technology increasingly affordable for law enforcement agencies with limited budgets. The success rate for solving cold cases using these methods hovered around 60%. Not perfect, but dramatically better than the single-digit success rates for cases that went cold before technological intervention. Ashley Torres, Jennifer's former roommate, had stayed in touch with Daniel over the years. She'd become a teacher, as Jennifer had planned to, and every year on the anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, Ashley would do a lesson with her students about kindness and checking in on friends who might be struggling. She never named Jennifer specifically, wanting to protect the privacy of the story, but she taught her students that everyone is fighting battles others can't see, and that sometimes reaching out can save a life. In 2035, Ashley was diagnosed with breast cancer. The prognosis was good, early stage, treatable, but the diagnosis shook her. She reached out to Daniel and told him she needed to confess something she'd carried for 28 years. When Jennifer received that phone call the night before she left, Ashley had pretended to be asleep, but she'd heard more than she'd told police. She'd heard Jennifer crying after the call ended, heard her whisper, "I don't know what to do," to herself in the darkness. Ashley had been 19 years old, absorbed in her own life and problems, and she hadn't gotten up to check on her friend. She'd gone back to sleep. The next morning, Jennifer was packing to leave, and Ashley had been running late for class, so she'd just called out goodbye from the bathroom. Ashley sobbed as she told Daniel this, saying she'd wondered for nearly 3 decades if things would have been different if she'd gotten up that night, if she'd asked Jennifer what was wrong, if she'd convinced her to stay, or at least not to go alone. Daniel listened quietly, then told Ashley something his therapist had told him years ago, that guilt is the currency of the bereaved, but it's counterfeit money. Jennifer had made her own choices, influenced by factors no one could have predicted or controlled. Ashley's presence or absence that night wouldn't have changed Christopher's calls, or Jennifer's decision to meet him, or the loose gravel on that access road. They talked for 2 hours, and by the end, some of the weight Ashley had carried seemed lighter. She went through her cancer treatment successfully, returning to teaching the following fall. She and Daniel became closer friends, united by Jennifer's memory and by the understanding that healing is a process that never truly ends. It just evolves into something you can carry without being crushed by it. The support group Daniel and Linda founded expanded to 5 chapters across Arkansas and Oklahoma by 2036. They'd helped 43 families navigate the search process for missing loved ones, connecting them with resources, technology companies, and experienced investigators. 7 of those families had found their loved ones, 3 alive and 4 deceased. The others were still searching, still hoping, sustained by the community and the knowledge that they weren't alone. Jenny Calloway, now 16 years old, started volunteering with the organization. She had her aunt's love of helping people and her father's determination. She created social media campaigns for families of missing persons, using her generation's fluency with platforms and algorithms to spread awareness. One of her campaigns went viral, leading to thousands of tips on a case that had been cold for 5 years. A woman was found alive, suffering from amnesia after a car accident, living in a care facility in another state. The reunion between the woman and her elderly parents made national news, and Jenny's role in facilitating it earned her recognition from the governor. Daniel watched his daughter accept the award at a ceremony in the state capitol and thought about his mother, about how proud Patricia would have been. He thought about how Jennifer's life, though cut tragically short, had created ripples that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Her disappearance had broken their family, but her discovery had somehow created purpose from that brokenness. The pain would never fully disappear, but it had been transformed into something that helped others, that prevented other families from enduring decades of not knowing. On what would have been Jennifer's 51st birthday in 2040, Daniel and his family made their annual pilgrimage to Oklahoma. The marker he'd placed 36 years earlier was still there, weathered but intact. Fresh flowers sat beside it. Someone else had been there recently, someone else who remembered or had been moved by the story. Daniel's children, now adults themselves with children of their own, stood quietly as he placed another bouquet and spoke softly to the sister he'd lost when he was just 15 years old. "We're okay, Jen," he said to the prairie wind. "We're all okay, and you helped us get here, even though you've been gone all these years. Mom's with you now, wherever you are. She found you in the end, just like she always said she would, and we're going to keep telling your story, keep helping other families, because that's how we honor you. That's how we make sure your life mattered beyond that one terrible day." The sun set over Route 66, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The Calloway family stood together in the fading light, 3 generations bound by love and loss and resilience. In the distance, cars passed on the highway, travelers moving through this forgotten corner of Oklahoma without knowing the story that lived here, the tragedy that had unfolded and eventually been resolved through persistence and technology and the fierce love of a mother who never gave up. Jennifer Calloway had been missing for 18 years before an aerial scan revealed her car buried in a ravine. But in the 33 years since her discovery, she'd never truly been gone. She lived in the advocacy work her death inspired, in the families reunited through technology developed because of her case, in the children who carried her name forward, and in every person who heard her story and decided to pay closer attention to the people in their lives who might be struggling in silence. The story that began with a young woman checking into a motel on Route 66, frightened and alone, ended with a family healed enough to help others heal. It ended with technology that saved lives and solved mysteries that had seemed unsolvable. It ended with the understanding that even in our darkest moments, even in tragedy and loss, there is always the possibility of transformation, of taking the broken pieces of our lives and building something that helps prevent others from shattering in the same way. And somewhere in that Oklahoma prairie, beneath a sky full of stars, Jennifer Calloway finally rests in peace, found, remembered, and loved beyond measure.